Okay, okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. And hopefully, we're live. So, today we're going to continue our exploration of political theory, especially in the context of this intersection of traditional political theory, if you want, domestic political theory, and international political theory, which is what we're trying to do this year. Now, immediately, I have to signal that to a very large extent, what we're doing here is very much work in progress for me. And I was tempted to start my lecture on Thucydides with these methodological precautions that this is kind of all work in progress. But then I decided that maybe it's best not to waste time. However, after I've done the lecture and went back and listened to it, I'm always very dissatisfied, right? Trying to hold myself to a high standard. And so, the lecture on Thucydides was the first time I tried to do a full-length lecture. And technically speaking, from the standpoint of the schedule, we have 2 hours. 2 full hours, which is like 4 academic hours, really. So we have 2 classes, which is 2 classes to devote, right? Which is 4 academic hours, right? Which is close to 3 astronomical hours. And so it took a lot of time, but in general, I'm reminded of a very famous saying by Karl Marx. I'm sure other people have expressed it as well. When he writes to Engels, apologizing, saying that, apologies, Engels, for writing so long. I didn't have time to make the letter shorter, right? So hopefully, this is a first pass, and hopefully on the second pass I'll be able to be somewhat briefer. Now, to some extent, I was actually thinking maybe I shouldn't really be even uploading this to YouTube because of the nature of work in progress, right? But on the other hand, I thought that I think it's a good idea to say these things out loud and to have maybe a higher standard of holding myself accountable to potentially a wider audience of people who could be listening. I actually already see some people on the live stream, which is very nice. Yes, Brian, good evening. And I realized actually a bit too late, because my streaming setup is a bit crazy these days. So I realized a bit too late that people were actually writing in the chat last time I talked about Thucydides. Apologies for not responding, but I will try to respond this time towards the end of the lecture. And in fact, I think, like, in terms of housekeeping, this is basically how we're going to proceed. So after I'm done talking, I'll be looking at what people are saying here, and I think I'll also take a look at Teams. And if people want to ask questions, maybe if they could type their questions in the chat, this usually speeds things up. So this is kind of the preferred method, I think, of asking questions. Anyway, so I really want to get to Machiavelli. So before I start, let me say a couple things. So I do have 2 videos on Machiavelli already available on the channel. The first one is a bit more substantive, from a while back. I think it's about 15 minutes. It's called Machiavelli, A Brief Defense, which is, my basic take on Machiavelli. And also there's a section on Coursera. There's also a segment about, approximately 10 minutes, slightly longer than 10 minutes. And it talks less about Machiavelli, I talk there, and more about the general context of, Renaissance and Reformation. The second one is available on Coursera. It's also available unlisted on the YouTube channel. I think I'll make it public after I'm done with the lecture, just in case people want to go and check those out. So these 2 videos are my concise but also far more structured takes on Machiavelli. So right now, this is potentially going to be super chaotic, because what I'm planning to do in the next possibly couple hours, we'll see how long I have time to go. Hopefully less than that, right? But what I plan to do in the next hour or so is to just give you some of my thoughts on Machiavelli. So many places I could start. I suppose one place I could begin is that Machiavelli is very dear to my heart. And in an important sense, what I want to do is I want to actually offer a defense of Machiavelli. Now, my general methodological conclusion, my general methodological rule is that I'm a skeptic first and everything else second. And I do take Machiavelli in my own thinking very seriously, but I know about myself that I have changed my opinions in the past, and I very much am open to changing my opinions in the future. But also, I want to be upfront about where I'm at right now, and kind of potentially open myself up to criticism of. I'm talking first and foremost to my students, but who knows? Maybe people on YouTube will have something instructive to say. I guess I want to, maybe kind of two things. I kind of want to say two things at the same time, and I'm sort of trying to arrange them in some particular order. These, I guess, like the two immediate contexts for me talking about Machiavelli would be Marxism and physicalism, if you want. So I take Machiavelli very seriously, again, in the context of Marxism and in the context of, well, let's write the word naturalism. So, and again, the two courses I teach are political philosophy and philosophy of science, and in some sense, so these are the two kind of, this is the intersection between the two. So we have political philosophy in terms of Marxism and philosophy of science in terms of naturalism. And in both, Machiavelli is deeply important. In political philosophy, he is important to me as an interlocutor of Marx. So Machiavelli with Marx, and in terms of philosophy of science, this would be sort of Machiavelli's anti-naturalism. Machiavelli's naturalism, Machiavelli's anti-teleology. So his naturalism, his anti-teleology, and with a question mark, his atheism. Now, of course, the term atheism is not a very well-defined term, and people get very emotional. Teleology. People get very emotional around atheism, but I feel that there's a maybe it's like, atheism is a very rude word. Okay, do I want to call myself an atheist? Well, the older I become, the more I teach, the more nuance I see, and it's like I feel that most people, and actually this is something I like to talk about a lot, right? So it's like Marx was not a Marxist, Machiavelli was not Machiavellian, Jesus was not a Christian, Simone de Beauvoir is not a feminist, Heidegger is not an existentialist, Epicurus is not an Epicurean, Plato is not a Platonist, right? So all these words, all these terms are always very deeply misconstrued once they enter popular vocabulary, partly because philosophy is in general about maintaining nuance and resisting the temptation of jumping to conclusion. So when I call Machiavelli an atheist, it's like it's a bit of a shorthand, and there's definitely something I think deeply meaningful behind this phrase, and Machiavelli definitely was opposed to at least certain forms of Christianity, and let's say glorified for political reasons certain aspects of, let's say, Roman pagan religion. But be that as it may, I don't want to necessarily talk about everything at the same time. And so Machiavelli is important in philosophy of science, also like philosophy of human beings and philosophy of society. So like his philosophical anthropology and social theory, and in general there's this kind of anthropology. And I mentioned in my course in philosophy of science that I feel that there's this overarching project of mechanistic versus teleological worldview, right? And I've tried to explain why I think mechanistic worldview, and I do want to say, right, so both in terms of Marxism and in terms of naturalism, I am a non-dogmatic Marxist and a non-dogmatic naturalist. So I'm a skeptic first, Marxist second, skeptic first, naturalist second. And in fact, lately, as I've been reading more about not necessarily Marx himself, but about receptions of Marx, right? I'm actually tempted to maybe stop calling myself a Marxist because, there are certain portions of Marxist legacy which I can deal with fine, but increasingly, students from around the world associate the word Marxism with with the policy of a Communist Party of China today in the 21st century. And actually, you know what? As a philosopher, my immediate response is I have no idea. I don't have any intelligent opinion about what China is doing. And very often people that's the danger of politics. That's the danger of these holy wars on Twitter, right? Or holy wars on YouTube. Everybody's supposed to have, every position on every question. But I want to be a proper philosopher, and I want to resist temptation to jump to conclusions, right? And I have friends who, I don't want to say friends, I have acquaintances who would consider me deeply immoral for, let's say, not criticizing the Communist Party of China. And I have friends who, who'd think, not friends, acquaintances, who would say that I'm deeply immoral for not immediately affirming the policies of China in the 21st century. And it's like, I am used to, in general, I feel like, this is one privilege of being a philosophy professor, is that you allow yourself a breathing room, you allow yourself time. So I've spent, let's say, about 5 years reading Leviathan, reading and rereading Leviathan many times, and reading commentary. And so I feel my opinion about Hobbes is, fairly intelligent, grounded at least to some extent. I don't have that kind of assessment of what happens in China, right? So I'm not prepared to say anything about that. Which is to say that, maybe this word Marxism, this label has become a bit diluted recently, and it's like I feel that there's less and less understanding on the part of people I talk to when I try to allude to Marx or Marxism. So maybe I should stop calling myself that. Even though, again, Marx himself is deeply important for me, and I suppose maybe I should mention. I should get to Machiavelli, but this is important in terms of Machiavelli, right? Because my reading of Machiavelli is actually through a certain kind of Marxist lens, right? So my understanding of Marxism is basically through my prism as an instructor in the University of London program. Yes, and we have a certain set of syllabi, we have a certain set of textbooks, we have a certain set of names. People like Alan Wood or people like Jerry Cohen. So I would imagine something so English-speaking Anglo-American reception of Marx, especially I would imagine British Marxism, right? Or it's like Oxford edition of Marxist works by McClellan, or maybe Michael Burawoy, if that name means anything to you, who was the president of American and then World Sociological Associations. Yeah, so when this is the kind of Marxism that's important for me, and that's important for me in my reading of Machiavelli. And the reason I mention this is, I understand a bit disorganized, and I said that this lecture is going to be a bit of a work in progress, but I'm getting there, right? This is important for me because in some sense, this is kind of the end game for me in our course, and I wanted to talk about this more when I spoke about Thucydides last time, and I suppose maybe I should mention this now. So this is actually a very important slide about Machiavelli, Marxism, and naturalism. I'll come back to it in a second. So, but before I do, let me talk about realism and Marxism. So this is a kind of a obviously in all sorts of ways a very complicated issue, a very complicated set of issues. But basically, I feel that both realist and Marxist perspectives are, I don't want to say true because that's a very strong word, are very informative, illuminating. Both are valuable to me to some extent. So, and at the same time, they are to some extent mutually exclusive. So again, I kept talking about this. I mentioned this last time in terms of perspectivism, right? So you combine many different perspectives. So this would be, again, if you want ideal types, Weberian ideal types, so, or perspectives. And the idea is that by combining these different sets of ideal types or perspectives, by putting on these different glasses, we get a richer view of reality. And what I'm going to say in a second will sound, there is a broad overlap. There is a broad overlap between realism and Marxism. There's a certain kind of anti-teleological view. There's skepticism towards morality, right? This idea that morality is very often or usually just mask for self-interest. This is common ground between realism and Marxism. There's a certain kind of materialism, general materialistic view of the world, anti-teleological view of the world, maybe, but also materialistic view of materialistic view of the world in general, like in terms of your philosophy of physics or your philosophy of, I don't know, soul, right? Realists like Thucydides or Machiavelli tend to, it's like, or at least the standard interpretations of those thinkers tend to be in materialistic terms, like not believing in divinities or divine interventions, not believing in gods, not believing in souls, not believing in the afterlife. Yes, so that kind of physicalism, which is again in common with Marxism, but also physicalism in terms of maybe materialism in terms of like human motivation, that human beings are motivated by material factors, right? So again, like material interest, if you want, and there's a certain kind of evolutionary logic of something like natural selection or maybe cultural selection, how realism sees the world as conflict, like in some sense, well, war of all against all, between individuals, between societies, but so does Marx, yes? And he talks about class struggle, or he talks, Marx would talk about competition between socio-economic formations, about how, for example, capitalism drives feudalism to extinction, right? Or how communism supposedly could or will or hopefully will drive capitalism to extinction, maybe in the future, maybe yes, maybe no. This kind of complicated legacy of Marx and how exactly to interpret Marx. Yes, so I want to say that there's a broad overlap, and in fact, ideally I should add this to the slide. Maybe I'll do this on the second pass. But also there are important differences, and like to me, I want to say that maybe like in this course, Marxist perspective and realist perspectives are the two most important ones, and they are, to me, in my head, in dialogue with one another, and they are kind of the most important interlocutors of one another. And so again, Marxism is the most important interlocutor and most important interrogator of the realist tradition, and realism is the most important interlocutor and interrogator of the Marxist tradition. Yes, liberalism is notoriously absent from this eternal dialogue in my head, and I'll have some, maybe I'll have something to say about that. But like in general, this might not make too much sense, this whole discussion that I'm having right now, which is, by the way, fairly unstructured, might not make much sense without kind of the basic building blocks. And if you want the basic building blocks of my thinking, if like nothing I say makes any sense, I would encourage you to go see my course on Coursera, which is available for free for the entire world, and you don't even need to register for Coursera. The lectures are available, it's just click and play. Yeah, and in general, I do find that probably for most people, I would imagine Coursera is a much more convenient platform than YouTube. I mean, Coursera is available for free, it doesn't have any ads. You can seamlessly download things from there, download videos, download audio, I think, as well. Speed things up. Like in general, I feel that it's a much more convenient tool to use. And again, the reason I say this is because ideally, everybody who's taking my course for credit, this particular course about international political theory, should have taken my course on Coursera last year. But there are exceptions, so I'm directing you to that. So in some sense, I'm kind of less interested in walking us step by step, but sort of to some extent maybe taking for granted, at least a little bit, that you're familiar with the basic material over there. So yeah, but let me go back a step. So I said that realism and Marxism have this overlap, and ideally I should add the overlap to the slide. So the overlap in terms of materialism, anti-teleology, but sort of materialism and also kind of materialism, anti-teleology. So materialism both in terms of human motivation, like explanation of human action, kind of determinism, if you want, and that again human beings can be explained deterministically, that there is no immortal soul and there's no free will. So no immortal soul, no God, no divinity, no providence. Let's put it that way: no providence and no free will. This is going to be my overlap, but then the important differences would be that, you know, and there's a certain symmetry between, I feel, between Marxism and realism. So basically, let's try to do this. So what the realists are going to say, so realism might accuse Marxism of being, you know, like foreign spies. Realists are going to say Marxists are foreign, you know, foreign subversive agents, like not just spies, but, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, let's say, well, I mean agents. Maybe, and the idea being that sort of you know, Marxists want to divide rich versus poor, or Marxists want to divide or will divide rich versus poor, and this will sort of divide and conquer, and therefore the enemy will win. So divide and conquer, and the enemy will win, meaning, I don't know, let's say if you're a French realist, you're going to say, well, we're going to be conquered by Germany or something like that. So, for example, France conquered by Germany, right? And the Marxists have like an exactly opposite argument, yeah. So the Marxists are going to say, Marxism is like Marxism is a mask for foreign, you know, foreign enemies, right? And here the idea would be that realism. So Marxists are going to say, no, realism is a mask for domestic oppression. Realism is a mask for domestic oppression. And so kind of realists want to divide basically workers against workers, workers against workers, and again divide and conquer, and therefore you know capital, or let's say labor conquered by capital, okay, something like this, right? And I kind of want to say that preliminarily both of these accusations make at least some sense to me, right? And I think it's imaginable. I think we can find certain historical examples that point to both. Like I don't want to be facetious about this. I don't want to like oversimplify the issue, but at least preliminarily, my working hypothesis at the outset of this course, and again, this is the first year I'm giving this course. It's kind of this. Last time was my first lecture on Thucydides. This time was my first lecture on Machiavelli, right? So I kind of want to keep these ideas in mind, right? And specifically, I want to, like, my working hypothesis is that both are true to some extent. Both are true to some extent, and they appear mutually exclusive, maybe, but the world is multidimensional. Again, I'm sure I gave this example last time. If you imagine let's say, a cylinder. A cylinder is a square looked in one dimension, looked at from one dimension, but from another dimension, from another point of view, a cylinder is also a circle. So it's both a circle and a square. Well, which is it? Well, it depends on how you look at it, right? Or if you imagine like a cone is both a triangle and a circle. And again, if you slice a cone, maybe you'll even get an ellipse, right? The conic section. Yeah. So, reality is multidimensional, right? And I feel that there's potentially room for both. And actually, as I was rereading Machiavelli for this lecture today, as I was rereading Machiavelli, I was actually constantly reminded of Marx. I was also constantly reminded of Rousseau, but also Marx, and I do feel that yeah. So go back a step. It's like when I was reading both The Prince and Discourses on Livy, again rereading for this particular lecture. Machiavelli will very often talk about how you have these nuances of everyday struggle, and in these nuances of everyday struggle, very often people will wear certain different masks, right? And I guess this is ultimately what Marx means by ideology, this systematic misrepresentation of reality, especially when a particular individual or a particular group of people misrepresent their interests as the interests of all. So maybe I could add this to the slide as well. So this notion of ideology, So misrepresenting a sectional, a particular interest, systematic misrepresentation of a sectional interest as the general will, as the interest of all. So in general, this idea of justice as merely a mask for self-interest. And this is kind of, I feel like in general, I mentioned this last time, but I feel this is a very important general notion, right, for us in this course, is to take a bit of a step back from the idea of values and ask about the value of values and the genealogy of values, the genealogy of morals, the Nietzschean question as to where do morals come from, right? And not necessarily assume, right, that morals have anything to do with morality, right? And I'm pretty sure it's like something I like to mention in my course in philosophy of science, how human beings are driven by beliefs, values, and desires. And to some extent, this goes back to Plato. To some extent, you can find this in Nietzsche or Weber, that human beings are driven by beliefs, values, and desires. And actually, if you look at history of the world, most of our beliefs are demonstrably false. Most of the beliefs people held throughout the ages were demonstrably false. Most of the desires that human beings have, well, I don't want to say most, but significant portion, does not make us happy. The satisfaction does not make us happy. And likewise, most of the moral convictions are not moral. The moral zeal is a very bad guide to, sort of like the morality of one's actions. So beliefs, values, desires. Degree of conviction has nothing necessarily to do with truth. Degree of desire has nothing necessarily to do with, with outcome, happiness. And degree of moral zeal has nothing necessarily to do with the actual morality, right? And in general, I feel that, again, within this materialistic framework, and maybe I should come back to this quote from Kant, which I'm giving basically every lecture, this der Schlund des zwecklosen Chaos der Materie, right? That the universe is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. And kind of by definition, if you start from these materialistic premises, I don't want to say by definition, by construction, by assumption, if you start from these materialistic premises, nothing is good or evil in and of itself, yeah? So think of Hobbes, think of David Hume, the is-ought problem, or Hobbesian phrase about whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire is that which man calls good, right? So if by construction you start from these materialistic premises, then um, then I mean then well I guess where was I going with this? It's like yeah, actually I kind of lost my train of thought there. But I guess what I was driving at is that for both Marxism and realism, morality has to be some sort of a construction. And like we have to ask the value of values about the value of values, and we have to look at this genealogy of values. How do they arise, right? And Machiavelli or Hobbes or Marx will start from certain, if you want, broadly speaking, biological or anthropological assumptions that human beings have a certain kind of nature, and therefore human beings have certain kinds of desires, right, that we are born with, and they give us some sort of basic inventory of our values, right? But then society can also do something to modify these values, what Rousseau will call perfectibility, right? So this capacity to not just desire certain things, but also to maybe change the things that we desire. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there are certain, it's like we are in this Heideggerian fashion thrown into this world, and we're not free to choose whatever, right? So it's like at the end of the day, we can modify our desires, but only on the basis of some other desires, right? So we're always, always necessarily apparently grounded, within certain constraints. Constraints given by real world. And again, after Hume, after Kant, and especially, in the 20th century, after philosophers of science such as, I don't know, Thomas Kuhn or Paul Feyerabend, it's very ambitious to talk about the real world, yeah? But, we all understand, at least pragmatically speaking, what the word real world limitations means. I don't necessarily, it's a bit of a silly example on the one hand, but on the other hand, why not? I mean, we talk about this COVID pandemic, yeah, and to some extent, certain aspects of the COVID pandemic are socially constructed, obviously, in kind of the responses, and some of the harm that the virus has done has been due to maybe mismanagement by local governments, potentially, right? But on the other hand, probably you, my dear listener, a very unfortunate fact, know personally some people who have suffered from COVID, yeah? And, so even though human reality is socially constructed and our perception of the world is mediated by the active mechanisms of our mind, and in some sense, indeed, David Hume could say that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Kant will talk about this, synthetic a priori, the way our mind structures reality. But, if somebody gets COVID, they cannot just wish to become happy and, just snap their fingers and become healthy. Yeah. So in this sense, there are these real-world constraints, even though sometimes it's difficult to know exactly what we're talking about. Anyway, but be that as it may, I kind of want to get to the gist of Machiavelli's philosophy, and I'm sure I'm forgetting. Yeah, well, okay, yeah. Before I get to Machiavelli, let me maybe go back to the slide. So I was talking about sort of Marxism and naturalism. So reading Machiavelli with Marx, but also reading Machiavelli as a naturalistic philosopher. So again, within this overarching project of mechanistic versus teleological worldview, I feel, again, and this is in some sense just my other course, which is philosophy of science, right? But I do feel tentatively, hypothetically, that the mechanistic worldview allows us to view nature in a clear light, but also to understand ourselves existentially, in these mechanistic, materialistic terms, as products of biological and cultural evolution, to understand ourselves better, right, and to treat our immediate others better, and to also, hopefully arrive at a better, more enlightened form of politics. And you could immediately say, well, it's like, what is the relationship of Machiavelli's project to some sort of, utopian or enlightenment projects that you can find maybe in Marx or in the classical project of enlightenment? Again, I mentioned last time that I guess for me the four fundamental thinkers of the project of enlightenment would be Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Mill. And Machiavelli, in this sense, I feel, is a very important precursor to this entire tradition, right? And I'm not sure if I should make this a new slide or something. But again, in Machiavelli, we have these phrases about virtù and fortuna, yes, and in general, right? So this is Machiavelli's, I feel, pessimism and optimism at the same time. Pessimism and optimism, and so somebody, I think Anastasia, I hope I'm remembering correctly, actually asked me the last time about Gramsci, and of course, when we talk about Machiavelli and Marx, Gramsci is a very important interlocutor of both, because he is a bit of a Machiavellian Marxist, yes. And Anastasia, I think, asked me, well, is Gramsci a pessimist or an optimist? And again, this idea of the pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, yes. And this is kind of, I feel, the formula which is implicit in Machiavelli in his talk of Virtù and Fortuna. So Fortuna is the pessimism of the intellect, and then Virtù is the optimism of the will. Yeah, so when we talk about these two phrases, right, so Fortuna refers to chance, and this is the anti-teleological, the mechanistic notion in Machiavelli that, this universe is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. This universe is not naturally our home, that human beings are not automatically cooperative, that human beings are not automatically pro-social, and in fact, there is no natural, obvious, consensual definition of the word good, and different people mean when they say the word good, might mean different things, right? So there is no natural cooperation, and there is this possibility of irreducible conflict between people, right? So people are not, in this sense, naturally reliable, not naturally automatically pro-social. People are less than perfectly cooperative, right? And this is, when we talk about Fortuna, I could write all of these issues there. And not to mention that, of course, there are potential external circumstances. Like, we spoke last time about Thucydides, about pandemic, right? So, for example, the plague that broke out in the city of Athens as the Athenians were hiding behind the city walls, right? So there's always this potential of the forces of nature, or I don't know, floods or volcano eruptions, right, disrupting the normal course of events, or maybe droughts or famines, right? And there is this, if you want, quasi-pagan, somewhat anti-Christian view of Fortuna in Machiavelli, right, in this sense. But on the other hand, there's also this understanding, in terms of virtù. Virtù is an interesting word, and again, to some extent, I'm kind of skipping over, because I like to begin. I like to always begin these discussions with by talking about ancient sophists, and for that, I would highly encourage you to go and watch my lecture on the sophists on Coursera, for the full context. But I feel, again, once we kind of step back from these simple, facile, uncritical definitions of the word good, right, that our culture just gives us, right? So there's this, habitual, customary definition of the word good. So versus customary, habitual definition of the word good, and we actually ask ourselves what is good. Machiavelli will have something like a quasi-utilitarian definition of the word good. I mean, obviously, we shouldn't call Machiavelli a utilitarian, period, but there's a utilitarian element in what Machiavelli is saying, right? That ultimately, and you could say, maybe this is reason of state, raison d'état, or he has this, maybe let me write this in French, raison d'état, maybe, yes. And also there's this interesting phrase in Italian that Machiavelli uses, this mantenere lo stato, maintain the state, right? which is some form of, security, right? And so this is quasi-utilitarian, and to some extent, maybe I don't want to necessarily use the word objective, because again, after Kant, after Hegel, after Heidegger, after Thomas Kuhn, talking about objectivity is always very problematic. But there is a certain aspect in which, I have my desires, you have your desires, right? And this is, deeply subjective. But when we talk about security, that seems to be much less subjective, right? And again, I am, broadly speaking, I would subscribe to some kind of constructivist paradigm in epistemology, so I don't want to use the word objectivity, or I don't want to use the word objectivity lightly, right? But in terms of security, in terms of these real-world constraints, right? So it's like, when people ask me, students very often ask me, isn't this talk of human nature, isn't this parochial, right? But even though philosophically this is a complicated argument, I don't expect you to take this as a knockdown argument in favor of this realist position, or materialist or anti-teleological position, or this kind of position, like essentialist position, like reifying the concept of human nature. But on the other hand, it's like there is a certain bottom line, there's a certain like hard line of what we mean by human nature, in the sense that, like, you and me, we need oxygen to survive. You and me, we need a certain amount of calories per day to survive. We need, this certain standard of clean water, right? And I don't know, mercury is highly toxic, or uranium, or radioactivity, or lead in the water, or certain other elements, or talk about again COVID or some other diseases, how people actually die. Or I mean, when we talk about security, obviously there's guns and bullets and weapons and missiles, and they kill people, right? And like within the constructivist paradigm, we have to be careful before we just outright call all that stuff objective, because it goes through a certain prism. Like human relation to reality is always mediated by discourses, by narratives. We never have unproblematic access to the world as it really is. But at the same time, this is not like a carte blanche. This doesn't mean anything goes, because I'm talking to you right now. But if right now a missile strikes my house, right, this lecture will cut off, and it's important not to forget about that as well. But be that as it may, right? So what I'm kind of ultimately, I guess, what I'm driving at is that in this sense, values do not have a firm grounding in like ontological grounding in the nature of the universe. And again, this is a skeptical move. Hobbes is going to make a similar move. We're going to talk about Hobbes next week, right? So it's like, what are values with capital V? We don't know. We don't have access to this understanding of what are capital V values. And therefore also, there's no such thing as capital O obligation, right? And this is important. And in this sense, we can see Machiavelli as anti-Kant and anti-Locke, or maybe also as anti-Augustine, anti-Kant, anti-Locke, and also, I guess, anti-Augustine, right? And this idea that actually there's nothing is valuable, nothing is good in and of itself. There's no there's no such thing as an unconditional capital O obligation. That at the end of the day, in some sense, we have rights before we have duties. Again, and that kind of law is based on lawlessness. Maybe some sort of violence, primordial violence, and also kind of society as deeply artificial. Society as deeply artificial. And again, I'm not sure if this is the best time to talk about this, but let me at least mention, right? One corollary of this is that there's potential for like genuine enmity, right? And you can imagine opponents with equal moral claims against each other. And I forget if I spoke about this last time, but definitely, I mean, if you imagine countries at war, it could be that, both sides believe that their war is just from their standpoint. war is just. So each legitimately believes that their cause is just, right? Or you can, again, in terms of a simple, and this is why I really don't like the trolley problem, and I think that the trolley problem doesn't really show that utilitarianism is false. I would call myself a kind of a utilitarian, and I'm prepared to defend utilitarianism. I feel that the trolley problem is just a way, like how within mathematics you can construct a mathematical problem in such a way that it doesn't have an answer, right? So if I ask you for, let's say, roots, find a real root of a particular function which simply has no roots. So some questions, well-posed questions in mathematics, have no answer. So I feel, in a similar fashion, I am prepared to defend, the axiomatic of utilitarian philosophy, and I just feel that there are certain situations in which legitimately, genuinely, there is no right answer. Again, and I don't want to recap the trolley problem. Actually, I'm allergic to trolley problem, and it gives me a headache. Let me give you a much simpler example. We all love post-apocalyptic, scenarios these days. Post-apocalyptic movies, books, games, what have you, right? So imagine this is post-apocalypse, right? And there's two people in the street, fighting over, the last chocolate bar or something like that, a food ration, right? And it's like either I kill you and survive, or you kill me and you survive. What kind of a claim do you imagine there? What would Kantian categorical imperative tell you in such a situation? Like, I feel that in some sense, on this realist materialist picture, the only the only valid naturalistic basis for morality has to be common interest. And very often, like in times of war, there would be no common interest. Or potentially there could be no common interest between the two fighting opponents. Or in this, imaginary post-apocalyptic scenario, although I shudder to think that this imaginary post-apocalyptic scenario actually has plenty of real-world examples. You can find plenty of instances in reality where something like this, unfortunately, does happen, maybe is happening right now, right? And it's tragic to think about that, but let's go back to the realm of the imaginary, yeah? So if you don't have a common interest, so kind of justice or morality as grounded in common interest, And I do have actually several videos about sort of freedom as the fundamental problem of politics, or actually I think I have a whole separate video about common interest and values and obligations, right? Again, very important, as opposed to Kant and Locke. I'm not sure. I don't necessarily want to go into this rant right now, but I do find Kant and Locke to be, and actually Augustine as well, to be deeply utopian, actually dangerous, dangerous thinkers. And again, this notion of just war, which is actually to some extent associated with both, with Kant and with Locke and with Augustine, just war, right? I don't think that wars are ever just in a sense in which Augustine or Locke or Kant thinks. So Kant is a bit more complicated because Kant in general is a pacifist, but sort of in this Lockean or Augustinian fashion. And I guess kind of what I'm driving at is that, should I talk about, well, I guess this is a bit of a sidetrack, but sort of in the general vein of what I've been talking about, right? If you think about, Augustine, as a bishop in northern Africa, he writes about these sort of nomads, like who are attacking their Christian communities, and he talks about the just war, justice and self-defense, right? And it's like Augustine is this self-conceited, this self-congratulating bishop who thinks that he's so pious and righteous and virtuous, and he has his small community, I don't know, of Christian farmers, broadly speaking, within the umbrella of the Roman state. And what would Augustine say? Well, they're simply acting in self-defense. They are peaceful Christian farmers. They simply want to be left in peace to farm their lands. Why do we have these nomads attacking from the desert and trying to take away our crops and our fields? Well, it's like, and from a certain limited perspective, one might be tempted into this Augustinian point of view and to say, of course, it's very clear. You have peaceful farmers and you have these aggressive nomads. The nomads, Augustine would say they're sinful, they are committing sins, and it is the Christian thing to do. Amazingly, not to turn the other cheek, which is, I think, what Jesus would say, but this is not a class in theology. Somehow, right? Augustine doesn't say that we should turn the other cheek or, share bread with the nomads. No, he says, we are under an obligation, and he gives some quotations about this centurion, I think, from a very problematic quote, I think. Not necessarily the way I would interpret this biblical passage, but Augustine finds some support among the biblical quotations. I guess I would imagine mostly from the Hebrew Bible, but also some very controversial passages, I would say, from the New Testament, right? To say that, of course, we have to protect ourselves again, and we're doing God's work. We are, it's like. Jesus heals the slave of the centurion. Jesus heals the slave of the centurion, right? And so we are, centurion was pleasing to God, right? And so we as soldiers should be pleasing to God as well. We're going to fight just wars. Well, of course, I don't want to overdraw this because Augustine also thinks that most people are sinful and will go to hell. And, did Augustine actually believe that he was a good person and he would go to heaven? It's not clear. He's probably, his philosophy is shot through with self-doubt and actually potentially even maybe self-hate. So, I'm not kind of, I don't want to overdraw this position, overstretch this position, right? But, leaving the nuance aside and coming back to this core issue about just war, right? So I feel that Augustine would say that their cause is just. We are peaceful farmers. Our cause is self-defense. We are fighting God's war against the nomads. But, and here comes Machiavelli. Here comes maybe Marx, more importantly than Machiavelli, but kind of Machiavelli and Marx together. They would say, well, but why are the nomads attacking you? Isn't it the case that the nomads are attacking you because, like in general, in the structure of human history, it was the agricultural communities who have pushed the nomads out into the desert. And now, yes, life in the desert is hard, and people cannot necessarily survive there very well. And so now, when you have established your property rights with your, as Marx later is going to talk about this, obviously we're not talking about bourgeois property rights in ancient Rome, but the analogy still stands. Right? So when you talk about this legality and kind of peacefulness, right? Your legality, Augustine, your peacefulness, Augustine, is the Pax Romana. Yes, you have first pushed the nomads out into the desert, many generations ago. And now you're very happy to say, well, come on, we're peaceful, we just want non-aggression. Well, but that's protecting the status quo. That's in fact sanctifying and glorifying the status quo. Whereas in fact, the status quo, you think that you are peaceful, but actually your Pax Romana, your status quo, does structural violence to the nomads. You are effectively killing the nomads by preventing them from accessing fertile lands which you are working on, right? And this is something I feel which escapes this Lockean or Augustinian worldview, but something that Machiavelli or Marx, right, are going to be very attentive to. But like at the end of the day, I feel that sort of it's possible, not necessarily in this example, but it's possible to construct a similar example in which, and this, I'm not a fan of the just war theory. I don't think that, like in general, I would be very skeptical of any claim of any war to ever be just, right? But in this particular example, or not necessarily in this particular example, but like in a general case, I could imagine you could say that nobody's in the right here. Nobody is in the right here. Justice or morality is ultimately a question of common interest. And the nomads and the farmers do not necessarily have a common interest. So maybe this is genuine enmity. They are genuinely enemies, and both are right in their own respective way. like in this world, which is less than perfectly harmonious, it's either the nomads will conquer and live, or the farmers will defend and live. But there is kind of not there is not necessarily a world in which they can both live in peace at the same time, right? So this is, you will notice I'm not talking about the details of Machiavellian theory very much, but I guess, I mean, your home assignment, your textbooks are going to fill you in on the stories of Machiavelli and his biography and, you know, some of the things that he says, right? But I guess I want to mostly focus on these kind of broad, overarching issues, right? And so immediately kind of finishing up, hopefully, this whole discussion, because kind of this whole discussion began with this idea of how mechanistic worldview, and in this sense I'm including Machiavelli in the mechanistic worldview, allows us to understand our nature better, to understand ourselves better, to understand ethics better, and to understand politics better, right? And so in this sense, what is the positive project of Machiavelli? Positive project of Machiavelli. And this is not necessarily a very clear thing. And again, I mentioned this pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But I do feel that there's a broad compatibility between Machiavelli and the project of enlightenment. Or maybe the project of the enlightenment, just to be slightly more grammatical. And this broad compatibility, so lies in this notion that, again, so you have this quasi-utilitarian raison d'etat, security, and society is deeply artificial. But the idea, again, against this general enmity, but this notion that in the same fashion how science allows us to understand the laws of nature, understand nature, and therefore reshape nature for our purposes, to suit our desires, to make us happier, to suit our desires, and especially our collective desires, which is again what I mentioned a second ago about justice. Justice being ultimately grounded in common interest, right? So in a similar fashion, so this is, I guess, natural science, right? So in a similar fashion, social science allows us to understand society and human nature, right? And therefore reshape society in such a way as to suit our collective desires, right? And I do, Machiavelli obviously was pessimistic in his general outlook, and he talks a lot about the inertia of institutions and about how, in general, human nature, human desire for glory, materialistic, selfish, insatiable interests are such that I feel that Machiavelli is not necessarily very optimistic about this, but certainly Machiavelli believes that at least for a time, it is possible to create a certain kind of an arrangement which would, secure the genuine common interest, right? And so obviously the privileged example of all this for Machiavelli would be the Roman Republic. And he has a lot to say about, Roman Republic, right? But also, when we talk about, and, do I want to defend my reading of Machiavelli as a Republican philosopher? Well, I don't want to talk necessarily about everything at the same time. This is a big question, and maybe let's come back to it and discuss it in the seminars. My reading of Machiavelli is deeply Republican. And in fact, as I was reading Machiavelli, especially the Discourses on Livy, I was constantly reminded of Rousseau. So much so that I kind of most of the time, I have this illusion in my head that I'm simply reading Rousseau. Like halfway through the text, I would forget that the author is Machiavelli, and I would just like, okay, yeah, this is Rousseau. This is Rousseau giving us, these moralistic examples from the Roman Republic. And I have to also admit or acknowledge, whatever, or warn you people that I feel that both Machiavelli and Rousseau, I feel, idealize Roman Republic, right? And maybe they are doing this quite self-consciously. In fact, I think that Machiavelli, in the beginning of the Discourses, talks about how historians very often, he talks about the problems with history. That sort of history is written by people. Events have happened a very long time ago, so you can't necessarily know exactly how things happen. And so I feel that Machiavelli and Rousseau do idealize the Roman Republic, and to some extent, maybe they do this quite self-consciously. So, maybe this is a self-conscious idealization. But ultimately, the point is that, and we have this phrase, this mantenere lo Stato, the Italian phrase, the idea that at the end of the day, yes, society is based on common interest, and we do have a common interest in security, right? So maybe let me add here, right? So common interest in security, and especially this is, the most important chapter of the Leviathan that nobody reads. This is Hobbes's Leviathan. So Leviathan, chapter 30. This idea that the strength of the sovereign is the vigor of the subjects. And very often Machiavelli will talk about how, actually both successful republics and successful monarchies or successful principalities, right, have to rely on the good of the people and so on the strength of the people. And Machiavelli actually has this very nice phrase. He talks about how not to be hated by the people is actually the best protection for the prince. the kind of if I'm not sure if I'll be able to find this quote quickly, but I actually had it. I had it somewhere close at hand. Yeah, the best possible fortress is not to be hated by the people. How about that, right? And so this is a sentiment. This is a sentiment that Machiavelli, right, expresses in the Prince, and similar sentiment that Hobbes expresses in the Leviathan. So again, the best possible fortress is not to be hated by the people. How about that, right? And Hobbes is going to say that the strength of the sovereign lies in the vigor of the subjects. That ultimately, at the end of the day, the interests of the prince or of the monarch and of the subjects is the same. And it's a complicated, interesting question because the kind of the normative ideal of Machiavelli and of Hobbes are actually, I feel, fairly different. Well, Hobbes will talk about monarchy, but of course republics are also possible for Hobbes. And when Hobbes first begins thinking about monarchies, right, in the Elements of Law, Hobbes actually talks about monarchies, all monarchies ultimately being democracies, because again, as a social contract theorist, Hobbes believes that the only valid reason for the king to rule, the only valid justification of the king's rule or of the sovereign's, if it's an individual person of monarchy, is that the monarch rules in the interest of the people, right? That's what social contract means, and very often people forget this aspect of Hobbesian philosophy, right? On the one hand, and I mean, so when we talk about Machiavelli, I feel that Machiavelli's preferred form of government was some kind of, plebeian style mixed constitution, which is reminiscent of the kind of idealization of the Roman Republic. So mixed constitution, which is again usually associated, well, not necessarily, but usually associated with the way kind of Polybius reconstructs, again, kind of in an idealized fashion of how Roman Republic is supposed to be at this, a synthesis of kingship and aristocracy and democracy at the same time. I don't necessarily want to go into this right now, which is different from Hobbes, but you can also see some similarities, right? So anyway, so I was going somewhere with this. Yeah, okay. My mind is getting a bit foggy. Yeah, so understand society, reshape society in a common interest. Yeah, of course. And then so it seems that republics are first best for Machiavelli, although again, to what extent Machiavelli was a Republican, let's discuss this in the seminars, right? But kind of obviously Machiavelli is associated with his most important work, which is The Prince, and I feel that The Prince is very strongly suggestive of this notion of the second best, and I do feel that a careful reading of The Prince will verify my position, and I encourage you to read The Prince carefully, because ultimately I feel that what Machiavelli does in The Prince is he's going to say, so a strong prince is better than a weak republic. This is basically, I feel, Machiavelli's point. This is, you know, this is the reason why Machiavelli writes The Prince, right? And so specifically, Machiavelli says that Italy is disunited. Italy finds itself at the mercy of foreign invaders, and we need a strong prince to unify, to unite Italy, and to protect it from strong invaders. But at the same time, if you read The Prince and the Discourses, and Machiavelli is also a bit of an encyclopedic thinker, right? And this is a big difference of. Should I add this to the slide? Okay, I might add this to the slide, although, well, yeah, let me add this here. I have this Pasteman where I have talking about everything at the same time. So this is Thucydides and Machiavelli as encyclopedic thinkers, right? As opposed to, so, encyclopedic Thucydides, Machiavelli versus schematic Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes and Rousseau, right? In the sense that Thucydides and Machiavelli are actually quite difficult to summarize because they like to go into these very highly detailed descriptions of specific historical examples. And Thucydides obviously does this much more than Machiavelli. Also, Aristotle likes to do this, right? Aristotle is also an encyclopedic thinker. But what I'm driving at is that when we talk about princes and republics, right? So Machiavelli is actually very attentive to the institutional structure of society, and specifically about this institutional inertia. So, okay, I'm looking for a color. Okay, this color works. So institutional inertia, right? And he likes to talk about how, okay, you can have a wonderful prince, a genius lawgiver, right? Think of Rousseauian legislator. We'll talk about Rousseau in a couple of classes. And, anyway, so imagine this Rousseauian legislator. Imagine you have this prince who only has the common interest in mind. And he's trying to build a healthy and happy society, and not, not driven by hubris or narrow sectional myopic desires, right? Still, Machiavelli says, assume this idealized picture of the prince, but he says, come on, the prince will only be able to be active for a short period of time, maybe 20 years or 30 years, which will not be enough to change the character of the population, right? And so, Machiavelli talks a lot about again, institutions, especially institutions of self-government. And so Machiavelli talks about this, and Rousseau likes to talk about this a lot, how sort of if people are used to servitude, if people are not used to self-government, if people are not used to these institutions of self-government, if there aren't long-standing, established, functioning institutions of self-government, it's very difficult to create a republic from scratch. It's very difficult to create change, right? And I want to say two things immediately about this. So one is that I was unfortunately constantly reminded of the of the apparent ostensible failure of the Russian Revolution, right? Which, in some sense was implicitly predicted by Machiavelli and Rousseau. I would obviously Marx as well. Marx is the first person to point out that you cannot have a communist revolution in a peasant country, right? But both Machiavelli and Rousseau would say that in a country which is not used to govern itself, you make some kind of a coup, right? But basically, you are substituting one form of monarchy for another form of monarchy. And between the absolutism of Stalin and the absolutism of Tsar Nicholas, I feel that there's like a deep continuity. Like if you want to understand the horrors of Stalin's regime, you should look at the horrors of the Tsarist regime in Russia before the Second World War. Sorry, before the Russian Revolution, right? So it's a bit of a simplistic explanation, and I do encourage you to take it with a grain of salt. But it's there, and I feel that people very often will forget that, right? I mean, Rousseau, when he talks about Poland and talks about the abolition of serfdom, which he definitely welcomes and thinks is a good thing, but at the same time, Rousseau, in a deeply Machiavellian fashion, would say that you cannot just snap your fingers and abolish serfdom and imagine that human beings that yesterday's peasants will be able to govern themselves freely tomorrow, right? Freedom, this political freedom, is a very complicated task, complicated skill of governing yourself, right? It's something, again, society is artificial. You need these skills. These skills need to be developed. They cannot be developed overnight, right? So this was one thing I wanted to say. And another thing immediately here is that, again, I keep circling around this deep pessimism in Machiavelli, but also deep pessimism later down the line. We'll see this in Rousseau. I guess in Hobbes as well, but Hobbes is commonly considered a pessimist, right? But in Machiavelli and in Rousseau, there's this asymmetry, a deep asymmetry. Like if you imagine some sort of a strong, harmonious society in which the interest of the individual is strongly allied with the interest of the state, such as this idealized Roman Republic or idealized Spartan polis, right? Idealized polis of Sparta, Lacedaemon, right? It's very easy to, like, there's this deep asymmetry. It's very hard to make a good society, but relatively easy to break a good society, right? Like imagine an individual. How does an unhealthy, unhappy individual become happy and healthy? It's not an easy thing to do, right? So like in some sense, it's much easier to start smoking than it is to quit smoking. It's much easier to become an alcoholic than to stop being an alcoholic, right? Again, I apologize for giving these tragic examples, right? But it's true, right? Likewise, it seems that it's like if you're talking about a family, it's very difficult to for two people to come together and make a long-lasting, harmonious family, right? But it's we can see these examples like a dime a dozen, right? How most marriages end in divorce within the first 2 years, right? So people swear for all eternity that they will stand by each other's side, and then sort of discord sets in, right? So there's this asymmetry. Like I'm tempted to just quote the second law of thermodynamics, this universal tendency of entropy to increase. Like things can easily become more chaotic, right? And it's difficult to maintain order, right? And so both Machiavelli and Rousseau are very attentive to this notion that, again, this what Rousseau would call true social contract, even though Machiavelli doesn't use these phrases, but this kind of virtuous republic of virtue. It's very difficult to create, but kind of the natural tendency of this kind of harmonious order is to disintegrate, right? So, one person lies to another, a certain kind of transgression goes unpunished. People, again, are driven by these, narrow, myopic instincts for glory seeking, narrow, myopic instincts for accumulation, right? So people are not naturally, not automatically cooperative, so that there is this, by extension, natural tendency towards degeneration, right? And this is kind of something to be aware of. Okay. So actually, I have this, in the seminars. If you can think of a good example, when the state actually becomes better, when the state improves its condition, by all means, let me know in the seminar, because for me, this is to some extent kind of an interesting question, maybe a bit of a work in progress, because I can think of some examples, kind of from the top of my head, where there's a country, right? I mean, talk about Sparta or talk about Republican Rome. where there's a country and the country becomes corrupted and it sort of disintegrates, right? How the Roman Republic first becomes the prince, but then becomes the dominant, right? And you can see a certain downward spiral as far as historical reconstructions go, or like Sparta at the end of the Peloponnesian War, and this idea of how influx of booty, influx of gold, of wealth into the Spartan society corrupts the basic premises, the basic norms and values of Spartan society. So it's very easy for me to imagine how societies become corrupted. It's not so easy to find an example of a society which is less than harmonious and then becomes better. I specialize in classical political philosophy, so I don't specialize in modern sociology. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I've been to some places. Not an expert in any shape, matter, or form, but I'd say Switzerland strikes me as a pretty interesting society. It's like maybe not the most harmonious society in the world, but it's like I'm impressed in many ways. But it's like Machiavelli talks about Switzerland, and Rousseau talks about Switzerland as being this ideal of self-government. So it's like you see what I'm driving at? It's like Switzerland seems to have very strong starting conditions, and sort of Machiavelli parades Switzerland as the prime example of a self-governing European republic, and Rousseau will say, centuries, well, more than 100 years later, Rousseau will pile on similar kinds of praise, and kind of in the 21st century, still Switzerland is this often held as this wonderful example. But how do you get from here to there, right? So we may want to discuss this in the seminar, because it's not exactly easy to imagine. Now, obviously, again, within this broadly speaking Marxist and realist perspective, right? Always kind of if society becomes harmonious or more harmonious, there must be mechanisms that force people to cooperate. And specifically, for Machiavelli and for Hobbes, and actually I would say for Rousseau and for Marx, the ultimate pro-social emotion is fear. So in Machiavelli and Hobbes and Rousseau and Marx, fear is the pro-social emotion. Fear is the basis of society. And this is why I think I'm going to begin my lecture on Hobbes with this next week. That's sort of this ultimate question, sociological question of social theory. How is society possible? How is authority possible? What is the basis of society, right? And one way to answer this question is fear. Fear. The ultimate pro-social emotion is fear, especially fear of the common enemy, which unites society and galvanizes society, right? I think I mentioned this, when we talked about Diodotus last time. Diodotus and in Thucydides, in this Mytilenean debate, right? How Diodotus says that fear galvanizes societies. So let's not make city-states afraid of us, says Diodotus. Let's not make enemies of Athens afraid of Athens to such an extent that they will internally unite. On the other hand, Diodotus says, let's show clemency, let's show mercy, and this will encourage treason in our enemies. Yes, kind of give them second thoughts, switch to our sides, right? Encourage factional strife within our opponents. Yes, so this kind of goes back to this kind of mutual accusation, which I began the class with. Mutual accusations between realists and Marxists, right? I hope you can see the relationship of what I'm talking about in terms of Diodotus to this general schema, right? Yeah, so I was talking about how fear or threat to security, threat of a common enemy, is what galvanizes society. Again, in Machiavelli, in Rousseau, in Hobbes, but also in Marx, because in Marx, in the early, relatively early, optimistic young Communist Manifesto published in 1848, yes, Marx thinks that the capitalist dynamic will drive wages below subsistence, and so it's going to be the fear of starvation that will galvanize the working class, that will force the workers to unite. So I hope you can see how this is a deeply Machiavellian element in Marx, right? On the one hand, and does it happen? Will it happen? It's more complicated issues. And also, I want to say that while I was reading Discourses on Livy, I was constantly reminded of Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And I feel that if you read 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, a work by Marx, I feel that you will see deep Machiavellian elements and deep Machiavellian roots of that work, right? So like Machiavelli, Marx is very attentive to the peculiarities and the nuances of day-to-day political struggles, and especially these situations that, again, Machiavelli likes to talk about a lot, about how people will play the crowds, misrepresent the interests. Again, this notion of ideology, how a narrow group or an individual presents their narrow, myopic, hubristic, or pleonexia interests as the interest of all, right? How Louis Bonaparte misrepresents his narrow desires as the interest of France, for example, right? In terms of, and again, obviously Marx talks about it and he paints this picture where there's multiple moving parts, a very Machiavellian analysis, how you have different sections of the bourgeoisie, you have the army, you have the generals, you have Louis Bonaparte, you have urban proletariat, but also you have the peasants, also you have the petty bourgeoisie, right? You have the landed aristocracy, and these are far from the simplistic analysis in which you have like two classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Marx is actually very attentive to this, power play and power struggle, and how these, have these very problematic shifting alliances. Anyway, and again, Machiavelli definitely is also very open to that. So I guess I began this whole, this particular section with this, with this notion of how I feel that the strong prince is better than a weak republic, kind of trying to affirm Machiavellian republicanism, right, and to explain, at least a little bit, begin to explain the place of the prince within the structure of Machiavelli's work, sort of how Prince relates to the Discourses on Livy. And again, to just restate my conclusion, I feel that Machiavelli would say that the first ideal best is you want to be born a member of a free republic, but usually that's not in the cards, that's too difficult to achieve. So, we're going to settle for the second best, which is to be ruled by a strong prince. But it's also, again, very interesting because even in The Prince, Machiavelli will talk again in this Hobbesian, quasi-Hobbesian, or I would say proto-Hobbesian fashion about how, at the end of the day, the strength of the sovereign is derived from the vigor of the subjects. So actually the prince should be wary of the petty and fickle struggles of the aristocracy. Aristocrats will struggle against each other, and that's always going to be a threat to the prince. And so the prince should base their rule, their power, on the people, right? And ally with the people, and do good things to the people, take care of the people, and really take care of the people. Obviously, you can always try to lie and misrepresent, but at the end of the day, talk about this, complicated word in our post-constructivist epistemology, truth, right? Complicated word, but the idea is that maybe the easiest way to win people on your side is to really, although the word reality is problematic philosophically, to really help the people, and then they will genuinely stand by you, the prince, right? Yes. So there's a whole bunch of other things I plan to mention, and this was actually kind of, this was maybe even slightly more chaotic than I planned, and these were kind of, considerations around Machiavelli, and I will have to refer. I'm kind of even thinking maybe I should repost my lecture on Machiavelli, or maybe I'll post this in the comments. Not lecture, but there's a 15-minute segment in Machiavelli where I talk about kind of most of the substantial things, and I suppose this lecture is kind of secondary to that. This lecture, this work in progress, stream of consciousness. So let me see if we have some questions maybe, and let me just maybe try to understand how we're doing in terms of time. A bit of a mouthful. Okay. So I see a lot of people saying hi. And yeah, I feel maybe, I've been talking for quite a long time. Maybe what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna wrap up my speech here, which was again a bit of, apologies, a bit chaotic and a bit of a work in progress. Again, if you're looking for a more concise summary of Machiavelli, a more systematic summary of Machiavelli, I'll actually post a couple of, the links to a couple of other videos from my channel, which approach Machiavelli in a more structured fashion. Okay, be that as it may, I suppose by way of kind of wrapping this whole thing up, colleagues, let me just say thank you so much for sticking by. These are difficult times, especially in terms of the quarantine. Maybe I'll see some people face to face on Monday, although I feel that, again, in terms of the epidemiological situation, we still cannot be completely sure that we'll be back in classrooms on Monday. Thank you so much for dropping by the stream. I want to say good evening, and thank you very much for everybody who's been keeping in touch. I was kind of hoping to kind of record an update video talking about the experience of the first semester. The feedback has been great. I'm very grateful for people who are who are leaving YouTube comments, or who wrote in Teams, or people who actually came, dropped by face to face. We've managed to have some tea and chocolate, both in December and in January. And I don't necessarily always reply very quickly, but I think I think I've seen all the positive comments, and again, the general positive response, especially to Coursera, which was kind of the alpha and omega of my work in the past year. The general positive response was deeply inspirational, and I don't know. I guess to the people in the YouTube chat, good evening and thank you, Brian and Nikolai. I've seen some messages last time from you after the stream unfortunately has ended. And Varya, I think Varya, hopefully I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Again, I am hoping to record maybe this semester, but definitely during the summer months, to start recording maybe a more kind of well-organized, a more scripted series. Kind of right now at this point of my, I don't know, intellectual career, I'm still sort of recovering from Coursera. So as you can see, this is, again, fairly chaotic and, fairly work in progress. But that's kind of the whole point, that I'm doing this kind of stream of consciousness so that I can, listen to it, take notes, and maybe do a second pass in a more structured fashion. But nevertheless, I do hope that this was useful to people. Colleagues, if you have any questions, again, feel free to ask. I'll try to respond. And in general, I think we'll maybe host a bit of a Q&A in Teams right now. But otherwise, I think that's it from me. So next Saturday we're gonna do Hobbes, and I think we'll start. I'll start by directing people's attention actually to my lecture on Hobbes on Coursera, because there's no chance I'm going to be able to do a better job than that. So since officially we have 2 hours, two time slots for the lecture, I think that the first time slot is going to be the lecture on Coursera, and the second time slot is going to be maybe something like a Q&A, and maybe we'll try to bring out some of the international relations context in Hobbes if we have time. We'll see about that. So anyway, colleagues, I'm also kind of hoping to maybe go back to these live recordings with a camera. Right now, because of the peculiarities of my setup, I actually, well, to be completely honest, in this Aristotelian fashion, I prefer to talk so I prefer to walk while I'm talking, and it's kind of hard to make walking work together with a camera at the same time. Kind of sitting in front of a camera is a bit disappointing. Well, not disappointing, but counterproductive. Like my head doesn't work very well when I just sit in one spot. So anyway, colleagues, once again, thank you for showing up. These are interesting times, complicated times. I hope everyone is staying safe. And yeah, I'm just looking at Nikolai's comments. Um, yeah, well, yeah, Nikolai. I'm also kind of thinking, one of these days I'll get fired from the university, and finally I'll be able to do things at my own pace. We'll see. We'll see about that. So anyway, I hope everybody's staying safe in these complicated times. I hope this was of some use to people. Definitely I'll try to do a second pass on all this. So otherwise, again, thank you for showing by. For stopping by. Your company is greatly appreciated. And until next time, stay safe and take care, people. Take care.